It all started with a creak, a soft groan of wood above me as I sat in the living room one lazy Sunday afternoon. The noise was faint, barely noticeable over the hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen. But in the quiet of our house, it was enough to grab my attention. I glanced up at the ceiling, my eyes tracing the invisible path to the attic. I hadn't thought about that space in years. Since moving in with my husband, Daniel, it had been nothing more than a dusty, forgotten storage area. He'd always been the one to deal with it, stashing away boxes during our move and climbing up there during the occasional heavy rain to check for leaks. I avoided the attic like a child fears the dark. It was cramped, cluttered, and filled with cobwebs. Why bother? But that sound piqued my curiosity. Daniel was out running errands and I had the house to myself. After a moment's hesitation, I stood and made my way toward the narrow pull-down ladder in the hallway. My fingers hesitated on the latch. The attic wasn't locked, but something about it had always felt off-limits. With a deep breath, I tugged the ladder down and climbed up into the musty, dim space. Dust motes danced in the beam of light from a small, grimy window at the far end. Boxes and bins were stacked haphazardly, their labels faded or completely illegible. My initial curiosity waned as I coughed against the thick air. There was nothing remarkable here, just old furniture, forgotten books, and the usual accumulation of years gone by. Then I saw it. A faded green photo album, half buried under a pile of loose papers in an unmarked box. Something about it caught my attention, the worn edges, the way it seemed oddly out of place among the rest of the clutter. I reached for it, brushing off a layer of dust as I sat cross-legged on the floor. The first few pages were sweet, filled with photos of a younger Daniel. His boyish grin was the same as ever, though his hair was shorter, his face slimmer. I smiled as I flipped through pictures of him at what looked like family gatherings, on fishing trips, and standing in front of old cars I didn't recognize. But then the pages changed. There was a woman. She was striking, with dark hair that fell in loose waves over her shoulders. Her smile was warm and radiant, and Daniel was beside her in almost every photo. My heart started to thud as I turned the pages. In one picture they were on a beach, their arms wrapped around each other. In another, they were in front of a small house, her hand resting on his chest as he beamed down at her. And then I saw it. Them holding a baby. The photograph was grainy, the colors faded with age, but the details were unmistakable. Daniel was cradling a newborn in his arms, his expression one of pure joy. The woman leaned in close, her face glowing with the unmistakable look of a mother. I froze. My hands shook as I stared at the photo. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Daniel had never mentioned a child. Not once in the 5 years we'd been together. He hadn't mentioned this woman either. Who were they? And why was he holding a baby with such tenderness, such love? I flipped through the rest of the album, searching for answers. There were more photos, birthdays, holidays, snapshots of what looked like an ordinary happy family. But the timeline was fuzzy, and the faces of the child grew older, yet always unrecognizable. By the end of the album, the photos stopped abruptly, as if the story they told had been cut short. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind spinning with questions. Who was this woman? Was she Daniel's ex? Was the baby his? My stomach churned as I thought about the implications. If Daniel had a child, why hadn't he told me? When Daniel came home later that afternoon, I was waiting for him in the kitchen. The album sat on the table between us, its presence heavy and accusatory. He froze when he saw it, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker, guilt. "Where did you find that?" he asked quietly, his voice tight. "In the attic," I replied. "Daniel, who is she? Who is the baby?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sank into a chair, his hands rubbing his face as if trying to erase the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. "Her name was Rachel," he began. "She was my wife before you." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Before me?" I echoed, my voice trembling. "She died," he said, his gaze fixed on the table. "It was years ago. We were married, and yes, we had a child. His name was Ethan." The room seemed to tilt, my world upending with his confession. "You had a son?" I whispered. "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with pain. "Because they're gone, both of them. Rachel passed away in a car accident when Ethan was just a baby. He didn't survive either. My breath caught in my throat. The weight of his words pressed down on me, suffocating. Why didn't you tell me? I asked again, my voice breaking. I'm your wife, Daniel. How could you hide something like this? I didn't want to burden you with it, he said, his voice raw. It was the darkest time of my life. Losing them, it nearly destroyed me. And when I met you, I felt like I had a chance to start over. I didn't want to bring that pain into our life together. I stared at him, torn between anger and heartbreak. You didn't think I deserved to know? I asked, tears streaming down my face. This isn't just some painful memory, Daniel. This is your past. Your family. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting you, protecting us. But I see now that I was wrong. The conversation ended in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken emotions. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the images from the album. The woman, the child, the life Daniel had before me. It all haunted me. I tried to understand his reasoning, to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the man who had hidden such a monumental part of himself. In the end, I realized that the past isn't something you can bury. It lingers, shaping who we are, no matter how deeply we try to hide it. And while Daniel's secrets had shaken the foundation of our marriage, they also revealed a depth to him that I hadn't known before. A depth of pain, love, and loss that I would have to learn to accept if we were to move forward. The attic, once a forgotten space, had become the keeper of a truth I could no longer ignore. The days that followed were suffocating. The air in the house felt heavier, filled with the weight of unspoken words and the tension that now lingered between Daniel and me. Every time I looked at him, I saw fragments of the man I thought I knew, now reframed by the shadow of his past. He tried to reassure me, speaking in soft tones, apologizing repeatedly, but the questions in my mind only multiplied. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rachel's face, her smile from those photos etched into my memory. I imagined her laughing with Daniel, holding their child, living the life that now felt like an unwelcome intruder in my marriage. And Ethan, I couldn't stop picturing him, wondering what he might have looked like had he grown up. Would he have had Daniel's eyes? His quiet, thoughtful nature? I found myself drawn back to the attic, hoping to uncover something more. Anything that might help me piece together the puzzle of their lives. I spent hours sifting through boxes, finding old letters, receipts, and keepsakes. One box held a bundle of tiny clothes, carefully folded and wrapped in tissue paper. Another contained a small hand-knit blanket, its edges fraying with age. I pressed it to my face, inhaling the faint scent of something familiar but indistinct, a mixture of time and loss. Among the items, I found a journal. Its leather cover was worn, the pages inside filled with Rachel's handwriting. I hesitated, feeling like I was trespassing on something sacred, but curiosity and an ache for understanding pushed me forward. Her words were raw and honest, filled with dreams of the future, notes about Ethan's milestones and expressions of love for Daniel. One entry stood out, written just weeks before her death. She described a fight they'd had, a disagreement about something trivial, and how they'd made up afterward with promises to never let petty arguments come between them. The tenderness in her words struck me, and for the first time, I felt a pang of guilt for my anger at Daniel. He hadn't just lost a wife and child. He'd lost the woman who had loved him with an intensity one could now only glimpse through her words. But there was more. Buried beneath the journal, I found a stack of unopened letters addressed to Rachel. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp and angular, nothing like Daniel's careful script. I hesitated again before opening one, and as I read, a chill ran down my spine. The letter was from a man named Jacob, and its tone was intimate, far more personal than I expected. He wrote about missing Rachel, about longing to see her again, about wishing he could be part of her life in a way that he clearly wasn't. My hands trembled as I read through the letters, piecing together a story that seemed to contradict everything Daniel had told me. Jacob's words hinted at secrets Rachel had kept, secrets that suggested her life with Daniel might not have been as perfect as the photos made it seem. By the time I finished reading, my mind was racing with possibilities. Who was Jacob? Was he just an old friend? Or was there something more to their relationship? And if Rachel had been hiding things from Daniel, had he known? Had their seemingly idyllic life been built on lies? I didn't know how to bring it up to Daniel. Every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't let it go. The mystery of Jacob and Rachel's connection gnawed at me, pulling me deeper into a spiral of doubt and suspicion. I started to question everything. Daniel's version of events, Rachel's life, even my own role in uncovering these buried truths. One evening, after days of avoiding the topic, I finally confronted Daniel. The unopened letters were spread across the kitchen table, a silent accusation between us. His face paled when he saw them, his eyes darting from the letters to me. "Where did you find these?" he asked, his voice strained. "In the attic," I said. "Daniel, who is Jacob?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat down heavily, his shoulders slumping under the weight of whatever he was about to say. "Jacob was Rachel's brother," he finally admitted. "At least, that's what she told me." His words took me by surprise. "Her brother," I repeated, doubt creeping into my voice. "Yes," he said, running a hand through his hair. "She told me they had a complicated relationship. He was estranged from the family for years, and when he came back into her life, she was cautious about letting him in. She didn't talk about him much, and honestly, I didn't press her for details. I thought it was her way of protecting Ethan and me from whatever had happened between them." The explanation made sense on the surface, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The tone of Jacob's letters didn't feel like the kind of correspondence a brother would send. There was too much longing, too much intimacy in his words. I wanted to believe Daniel, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with finding the truth. I tracked down public records, scoured online archives, and even reached out to people who might have known Rachel. The more I dug, the more questions I unearthed. Eventually, I found Jacob. He was living in a small town a few hours away. His name listed in an old directory I'd come across in my search. I didn't tell Daniel where I was going. I wasn't sure how he'd react, and part of me didn't want to hear him beg me to leave it alone. When I arrived at Jacob's house, I was trembling with nerves. He opened the door cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he took me in. He was older than I'd expected, with deep lines etched into his face and a weariness that seemed to hang around him like a shroud. "I'm sorry to bother you," I said, my voice shaking. "My name is Emily. I was married to Rachel's husband, Daniel." His expression softened slightly, though suspicion lingered in his eyes. "Rachel," he murmured, the name heavy on his tongue. "It's been a long time." We sat down in his small living room, the air thick with unspoken tension. I explained what I'd found, the letters, the photos, the gaps in Daniel's story. Jacob listened quietly, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond me. When I finished, he sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "Rachel was complicated," he said finally. "She loved Daniel and she adored Ethan. But she had secrets, things she was too scared to share. Things she thought would ruin everything if they ever came out." "What kind of secrets?" I asked, my heart pounding. Jacob hesitated, his jaw tightening. "She told me once that Ethan, he wasn't Daniel's." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at Jacob, my mind struggling to process what he had just said. It felt as though the ground beneath me had shifted, leaving me unsteady and disoriented. My voice, when I finally found it, was barely more than a whisper. "What do you mean Ethan wasn't Daniel's? How is that possible? He loved that child. I've seen the photos. He was a father in every way." Jacob sighed heavily and looked away. His eyes clouded with memories he seemed reluctant to revisit. "Rachel made mistakes," he said quietly. "She got involved with someone else before she and Daniel were married. She thought she could leave it all behind, start fresh with him. But then she found out she was pregnant. By then, she and Daniel were already so deeply in love, and he wanted to marry her. She didn't tell him. She was terrified he'd leave if he knew the truth." My chest tightened at his words. The weight of Rachel's deception, the implications of her choice, settled heavily on me. "Did Daniel ever find out?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. Jacob hesitated, his fingers tapping absently on the armrest of his chair. "No," he said finally. "Not as far as I know. Rachel carried that secret to her grave. She wanted to protect him, protect their family. She thought it didn't matter because Daniel loved Ethan as his own. She thought the truth would only hurt him. The enormity of it all was overwhelming. I could hardly breathe as the pieces began to fit together in a way that painted a far more complicated picture of Daniel's past than I had imagined. The family I had envisioned from those photographs, the perfect, happy life he had before me, wasn't as flawless as it seemed. It was built on lies, however well-intentioned they might have been. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice trembling. "If Rachel kept it a secret all this time, why didn't you?" Jacob leaned forward, his expression somber. "Because you deserve to know the whole truth," he said. "And maybe Daniel does too. I don't know if he could handle it, but you're in a position to decide what happens next. You're part of his life now. You need to figure out what to do with what I've told you." I left Jacob's house feeling more conflicted than ever. The revelation about Ethan's parentage was a truth that could shatter Daniel's already fragile memories of his lost family. But how could I keep something so monumental from him, especially now that I knew? The question haunted me during the long drive home, and by the time I arrived, I was no closer to an answer. Daniel was waiting for me when I walked through the door, his face etched with worry. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice tinged with both concern and suspicion. I hesitated, debating whether to lie, but I knew it would only delay the inevitable. "I went to see Jacob," I admitted, setting my bag down on the counter. I needed answers. His expression hardened, and a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. "You went behind my back?" he said, his tone sharp. "Emily, I told you everything I knew. Why couldn't you just leave it alone?" "Because there were things you didn't know." I shot back, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "Things Rachel never told you." "I found letters, Daniel. Letters from Jacob to Rachel. He told me the truth about Ethan." Daniel froze, his face paling as the weight of my words sank in. "What truth?" he asked, though his voice was barely audible. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to say. "Ethan wasn't your son, Daniel. Rachel, she was with someone else before you. She never told you because she was afraid of losing you. She thought it didn't matter because you loved Ethan like your own. But he wasn't yours." The silence that followed was unbearable. Daniel stared at me, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "That's not possible," he said finally, shaking his head as if to deny the very idea. "Ethan was mine. I was there when he was born. I held him in my arms. How could he not be mine?" Tears welled in my eyes as I watched the pain etched into his features. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I thought you had a right to know. You deserved the truth, even if it's not what you wanted to hear." Daniel sank into a chair, his head in his hands. For a long time he didn't say anything, and I didn't dare break the silence. I could see the weight of the revelation pressing down on him, unraveling the threads of a life he had cherished and mourned. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a mixture of anger, grief, and something I couldn't quite place. "Why now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why bring this up after all these years? They're gone, Emily. Rachel and Ethan are gone. What good does this do?" I didn't have an answer. Part of me wondered the same thing. What good had it done to unearth this truth, to expose wounds that had barely begun to heal? But another part of me, the part that couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity, the need for honesty, knew that it was better to face the truth, no matter how painful, than to live in a lie. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I couldn't keep it from you. You've carried so much pain, Daniel, and now I understand why. Maybe this will only make things harder, but at least now you know. At least now it's all out in the open." Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he got up from the table and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the heavy silence and the crushing weight of the truth I had uncovered. In the days that followed, our marriage became a delicate balancing act. We danced around the subject of Rachel and Ethan, both of us afraid to delve too deeply into the emotions that lay just beneath the surface. I gave Daniel space, hoping he would come to terms with what he had learned, but the distance between us grew wider with each passing day. One night, as we lay in bed, the darkness enveloping us, Daniel finally broke the silence. "I don't know if I can forgive her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For keeping that from me. For lying to me all those years. But I loved her, Emily. And I loved Ethan. Does it even matter whose blood ran through his veins? He was my son in every way that counted. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. It doesn't matter, I said. Love is what makes a family, Daniel, not biology. And you were a father to Ethan. No one can take that away from you. In that moment I realized that the past, no matter how painful, didn't have to define us. It would always be a part of our story, but it didn't have to dictate our future. Together we would learn to carry the weight of those secrets, to navigate the complexities of love and loss, and to build a life that honored the truth while embracing the possibilities of tomorrow. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in our home began to shift, not disappear entirely, but morph into something more manageable, more subdued. Daniel threw himself into work, often coming home late, his tie loosened and his eyes heavy with exhaustion. I busied myself with the mundane rhythms of daily life, yet my mind never strayed far from the storm we were weathering. We spoke less about Rachel and Ethan, not because the subject had lost its weight, but because we were both afraid of reopening wounds that were still raw. One rainy afternoon, I found myself back in the attic, drawn once again to the relics of a life I had never known. The photo album was still there, its green cover now so familiar it felt like a part of my own story. I leafed through it slowly, tracing the edges of the photographs with my fingertips, wondering if there were things hidden in those smiles and candid moments that I had missed before. Each page was a reminder of the life Daniel had lived, the love he had shared, and the loss that had shaped him into the man I had married. As I closed the album, something caught my eye. A thin envelope that had slipped between the pages. It was addressed to Daniel, written in the same handwriting I had come to recognize as Rachel's. My breath hitched as I carefully opened it, the paper inside yellowed with age but the ink still bold. The letter began simply, "My dearest Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I wasn't brave enough to tell you in person. I've carried this secret for so long, and the weight of it has grown unbearable. I don't know how to say this, but I hope you can understand that I did what I thought was best for us, for our family. Ethan isn't your biological son." I stopped, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. Rachel had known, had felt the guilt of her deception, and yet she hadn't been able to confront Daniel with the truth. The letter continued, her words heavy with regret and love. "You are his father in every way that matters, Daniel. You've given him more love than I ever thought possible. I've seen the way he looks at you, the way he lights up when you walk into the room. That's what being a father is. It's not about blood. It's about the love you give and the life you share. I was afraid of losing you, of shattering the happiness we had built, and so I kept this from you. Please forgive me." I read the letter twice, then 3 times, each word sinking deeper into my heart. Rachel's confession wasn't just a revelation. It was a plea for understanding, a testament to the complexities of love and fear. She hadn't acted out of malice but out of desperation, clinging to the life she had built with Daniel and the child they had raised together. When Daniel came home that evening, I was waiting for him in the living room. The letter lay on the coffee table between us, its presence undeniable. He glanced at it, then at me, his expression wary. "What's this?" he asked, his voice cautious. "It's from Rachel," I said softly. "I found it in the photo album." His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the letter, unfolding it with care. I watched as his eyes scanned the words, his face a canvas of shifting emotions, shock, pain, and finally a deep, aching sadness. When he finished, he set the letter down and rubbed his temples, exhaling shakily. "She knew," he said, his voice barely audible. "She knew, and she didn't tell me." "She was scared, Daniel," I said, reaching for his hand. "She didn't want to lose you. She thought she was protecting your family." He didn't pull away, but his hand felt limp in mine. "I loved her," he said, his voice breaking. "And I loved Ethan. I would have loved them no matter what. Why couldn't she trust me with the truth? I didn't have an answer for him. How could I? The choices Rachel had made were hers alone, born from her fears and insecurities. I could only offer him my support, my presence, and the hope that in time the wounds would begin to heal. In the weeks that followed, Daniel and I began to talk more openly about Rachel and Ethan. It wasn't easy. There were tears, arguments, and moments when the pain felt insurmountable, but it was necessary. We sorted through the memories together, piecing together the fragments of their lives and finding solace in the love they had shared. One evening, as we sat in the attic surrounded by boxes and photographs, Daniel picked up the small knit blanket I had found. He held it in his hands, his eyes distant. "Ethan loved this blanket," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "He couldn't sleep without it. I used to sit by his crib and hum to him until he drifted off." I placed a hand on his arm, offering him a small smile. "You were a good father, Daniel. You still are, in every way that counts." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you," he said, "for being patient with me, for helping me through this." We decided to create a small memorial for Rachel and Ethan in our backyard, a quiet space where Daniel could honor their memory without being consumed by it. Together we planted a flowering dogwood tree, its delicate blossoms a symbol of life, love, and resilience. It became a place of reflection, a reminder that the past, no matter how painful, could coexist with the present and the future. As the seasons changed, so did we. The wounds didn't disappear entirely, but they began to fade, leaving behind scars that told a story of loss, forgiveness, and growth. Daniel and I found strength in each other, in the love we shared and the life we were building together. And though the attic remained a repository of memories, it no longer felt like a place of secrets. It had become a bridge between what was and what could be. Life began to take on a new rhythm, one that was quieter, gentler, and somehow more intentional. Daniel and I settled into a kind of fragile peace, the wounds of the past no longer bleeding but still tender when touched. We spoke of Rachel and Ethan sparingly, only when the moment felt right, but their presence lingered in the corners of our lives like a quiet hum, never intrusive yet never gone. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Daniel reached for my hand. His touch was warm, grounding, and I could feel the weight of what he was about to say before he even spoke. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady but tinged with something unspoken, "about Rachel, about everything she kept from me, and I think I understand why she did it." I turned to him, my gaze searching his face. He looked tired but calm, as though he had wrestled with something deeply personal and finally found a sliver of clarity. "Why do you think she did it?" I asked softly, giving him the space to speak. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to protect what we had. I've been angry with her, but the truth is I wasn't always an easy person to talk to. Back then I was so certain of how things should be, so focused on building a perfect life for us, that maybe I didn't leave room for her fears or mistakes. I think she was scared I'd reject her, reject Ethan, and that fear made her keep it all inside." His words hung in the air, heavy with introspection. I squeezed his hand, feeling a swell of admiration for the man sitting beside me. "That's a lot to admit," I said, "but it makes sense. She loved you, Daniel. That much is clear." He nodded, a small sad smile tugging at his lips. "She did. And I loved her. But I also love you, Emily. More than I ever thought I could love someone again. I need you to know that. I don't want the past to pull me away from what we have now." His words brought tears to my eyes, and I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. "I love you too," I whispered. "And I'm not going anywhere. We'll get through this together." The days turned into months, and the tree we had planted in the backyard began to bloom, its delicate flowers a quiet testament to the resilience of life. Daniel took to spending time by the tree in the evenings, sometimes with a book, other times just sitting quietly, lost in thought. I would watch him from the kitchen window, my heart swelling with a mixture of love and sadness. He was healing, but it was a slow, uneven process, like stitching together the frayed edges of a tapestry. One afternoon, as I was tidying up the attic, I came across a box I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked into a corner, its lid slightly askew, as though it had been hastily placed there years ago. Inside, I found more photographs, letters, and small trinkets, a collection of memories that felt deeply personal, almost sacred. Among the items was a small leather-bound book. I opened it to find Rachel's handwriting neat and precise, filling the pages. It was a journal, though not like the one I had found before. This one seemed to be more reflective, filled with musings about life, love, and motherhood. As I read, I felt as though I was getting to know a version of Rachel that Daniel might not have fully known. A woman who was deeply introspective, conflicted, and painfully human. One entry stood out to me. There are days when I wonder if the truth will come out, if the fragile foundation I've built will crumble beneath us. But then I see Daniel holding Ethan, the way his face lights up when Ethan laughs, and I know I can't risk it. They're happy. We're happy. And maybe that's enough. Maybe love can be enough to hold us together, even if it's built on a lie. The word struck a chord deep within me. Rachel had lived with so much fear, so much uncertainty, and yet she had chosen to lean into love, to believe that it could outweigh the shadows of her mistakes. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her, even as I wrestled with the consequences of her choices. That evening I shared the journal with Daniel. We sat together on the couch, the book open between us, reading Rachel's words in silence. When we reached the passage about love being enough, Daniel closed the journal and set it aside. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "She was braver than I gave her credit for," he said quietly. "She carried so much and I didn't even see it. I wish I could tell her that I forgive her." I placed a hand on his knee, offering him a small reassuring smile. Maybe in some way she already knows. The weeks that followed felt lighter, as though we had finally begun to shed the weight of the past. Daniel and I found a new sense of closeness, a deeper appreciation for each other that had been forged in the fire of our shared struggles. We started making plans for the future, traveling to places we'd always talked about, trying new hobbies together, even discussing the possibility of starting a family. The attic, once a space filled with secrets and unanswered questions, became a place of quiet reflection. We sorted through the remaining boxes together, deciding what to keep and what to let go. It was cathartic, a way of honoring the past while making room for the life we were building together. One day, as we were packing up the last of the items, Daniel found a small framed photo of Rachel and Ethan. He held it for a long time, his thumb brushing over the glass. "I think I want to keep this," he said, his voice steady but soft. "Not to dwell on the past, but to remember the love we shared. They'll always be a part of me, but they don't define who I am now." I nodded, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "Of course," I said. "They're a part of your story, and they always will be." As we placed the photo on a shelf in the living room, surrounded by pictures of our life together, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The past, with all its complexities and heartaches, no longer felt like a shadow hanging over us. It was simply a part of our journey, a thread woven into the tapestry of who we had become. And as we stood there side by side, I realized that love, messy, imperfect, and resilient, truly could be enough. As the seasons passed, our lives continued to unfold in a way that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. The once constant ache of the past had dulled into something gentler, a quiet hum of memory that no longer dictated our days but simply existed as part of the fabric of who we were. The flowering dogwood tree in the backyard grew taller, its branches spreading wide as if to embrace the space around it. Daniel had taken to sitting under it in the evenings, a cup of tea in his hands, sometimes lost in thought, other times simply watching the world go by. One evening, as the golden light of the setting sun filtered through the leaves, I joined him. We sat together in companionable silence, the warmth of his hand resting on mine. There was a stillness to the moment that felt sacred, as if the world had paused just for us. "I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness," he said after a long while, his voice low but steady. "About Rachel. About myself. About everything we've been through." I turned to him, my heart swelling with both love and curiosity. "What have you come to?" I asked softly, sensing the weight of his words. He sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think I've been holding on to anger for too long. Anger at Rachel for the secrets she kept, anger at myself for not seeing through them, and even anger at life for taking them both away before I could truly understand. But that anger doesn't serve me anymore. It's like carrying a heavy bag of stones. It only weighs me down." His words resonated deeply with me, echoing thoughts I had often wrestled with in the quiet moments of my own reflection. "Letting go of anger doesn't mean forgetting," I said. "It just means freeing yourself to move forward." He nodded, his grip on my hand tightening ever so slightly. "I think I'm ready to let it go," he said. To forgive Rachel and maybe even myself. It doesn't mean I'll stop missing them, but I don't want their memory to be tied to pain anymore. I want to remember the good things, the laughter, the love, the moments that made it all worth it. Tears welled in my eyes as I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. That's a beautiful way to honor them, I whispered. And it's a gift to yourself too. In the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle changes in Daniel. There was a lightness to him that hadn't been there before, a quiet joy that seemed to seep into the spaces between us. He smiled more, laughed more freely, and began to talk about the future with a sense of hope that had been missing for so long. It wasn't that the past had disappeared. It was still there, a part of him, but it no longer felt like an anchor pulling him down. Instead, it had become a foundation, something to build upon rather than be buried under. One Saturday morning as we were sipping coffee on the porch, Daniel turned to me with a look of quiet determination. "I've been thinking," he said, setting his mug down. "I want to go back to the cemetery, to see Rachel and Ethan. I haven't been there in years." The request took me by surprise, but I understood the significance of it. Visiting their graves had always been a painful prospect for Daniel, something he avoided out of a fear of reopening old wounds. But now it seemed he was ready to face it, to confront the emotions he had kept at bay for so long. "I'll go with you," I said without hesitation. "If you want me to." He smiled at me, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I'd like that," he said. "I don't want to do it alone." The following weekend we made the trip together. The cemetery was a quiet, sun-dappled place, the kind of serene setting that felt far removed from the hustle and bustle of daily life. We found their graves easily, two simple markers side by side, surrounded by a bed of wildflowers that had grown untamed over the years. Daniel knelt down, his fingers brushing over the etched names, and for a moment, he said nothing. I stood a few steps behind, giving him the space he needed while still being close enough to offer my support. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "I miss you," he said, addressing Rachel and Ethan as if they were there with him. "I always will. But I want you to know that I'm okay. I've found love again, and I'm building a life that I think you'd be proud of. I'll never forget you. You'll always be a part of me. But I'm letting go of the pain. I think it's what you would have wanted." Tears streamed down my face as I listened, the raw honesty of his words touching me deeply. When he stood and turned to me, I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him, holding him tightly. "They'd be so proud of you," I said. "I'm proud of you." We stayed there for a while longer, placing fresh flowers on the graves and sharing stories about the people they had been. It was bittersweet but also healing, a way of acknowledging the past while embracing the future. As we drove home, a sense of peace settled over us, the kind of peace that comes from facing something difficult and emerging stronger on the other side. The journey we had been on, through loss, love, and discovery, had tested us in ways I never could have imagined. But it had also brought us closer, forging a bond that was unshakable. In the months that followed, Daniel and I continued to grow together, building a life that felt rich with possibility. We talked more openly about starting a family, and for the first time the idea didn't feel daunting, it felt right. The attic, once a space filled with shadows and secrets, had become a place of light and remembrance. And the dogwood tree in the backyard, its blossoms growing fuller with each passing season, stood as a symbol of the resilience of love and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The past was still there, woven into the tapestry of our lives, but it no longer defined us. Instead, it had become a source of wisdom, a reminder that even in the face of heartbreak, love could endure, heal, and transform. And as we stood together beneath the wide branches of the tree one crisp autumn evening, watching the leaves turn gold and crimson, I realized that we were exactly where we were meant to be. Together, whole, and ready for whatever came next. As time moved forward, life became a steady current, carrying Daniel and me through days that were filled with quiet joys, small challenges, and the rhythm of simply being together. The intensity of the revelations and the pain that had followed began to feel like distant echoes, their sharp edges softened by the months of healing and growth. Yet, the lessons they had taught us remained vivid, shaping how we approached each other and the life we were building. The dogwood tree in our backyard flourished, its branches spreading wider, casting dappled shade over the small bench Daniel had placed beneath it. It had become his favorite spot for reflection, a place where he seemed to find solace in the embrace of its quiet beauty. Some evenings I would join him, and we'd sit together in comfortable silence, the world around us painted in the soft hues of twilight. It was during one of these evenings, as the golden light filtered through the leaves, that Daniel turned to me with a question that caught me completely off guard. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but thoughtful, "do you think we're ready to start a family?" My heart skipped a beat, not out of fear but out of the weight of the moment. It was a question we had danced around for some time, neither of us wanting to rush into a decision but both feeling the quiet pull of what could be. I met his gaze, searching his eyes for the emotions behind his words. There was no hesitation there, only a quiet determination and a glimmer of hope. "I think we are," I said softly, a smile spreading across my face. "I think it's time." His smile mirrored mine, and for a moment we just sat there, letting the enormity of what we had just decided settle over us. It wasn't a decision made lightly, but one that felt right, born from a place of love and readiness. It was a step forward, not away from the past but toward a future we could create together. The months that followed were filled with a mixture of excitement, anticipation, and the inevitable nerves that come with embarking on something new. We talked endlessly about what kind of parents we wanted to be, how we would create a home filled with love, and how we would honor the lessons life had already taught us. Daniel was especially reflective during these conversations, often bringing up moments from his time with Ethan, sharing memories that were bittersweet but full of warmth. One evening, as we sat in the nursery we had begun to prepare, Daniel held up a small wooden rocking horse he had found in the attic. "This was Ethan's," he said quietly, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the wood. "He used to sit on this for hours, laughing like it was the greatest adventure in the world." There was no sadness in his voice, only a deep affection that made my heart ache in the best way. "I think it should be here," I said, gesturing to the corner of the room. "A piece of him, part of the love that shaped you into the man you are. It belongs." He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I think he'd like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As we continued to prepare for the arrival of our child, I found myself reflecting on how much we had both grown. The journey we had been on, through secrets, loss, and the rediscovery of what truly mattered, had forged a bond between us that felt unshakable. We had faced the deepest parts of ourselves and emerged stronger, more connected, and more certain of the life we wanted to build. When the day finally came, it was as if the world had conspired to make everything perfect. The sun was shining, the air was crisp with the first hints of spring, and the dogwood tree in the backyard was just beginning to bloom. Our daughter arrived quietly, her first cries soft but strong, a sound that filled me with an overwhelming sense of awe and love. Daniel held her in his arms, his face a mixture of joy and wonder as he gazed down at her. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Emily. Thank you for giving me this." I smiled through my tears, reaching out to touch her tiny hand. "She's ours," I said. "Our family." In the weeks that followed, our home became a sanctuary of sleepless nights, soft lullabies, and the quiet magic of getting to know this new little person who had changed everything. The rocking horse found its place in the nursery, a symbol of the past woven seamlessly into our present. Daniel often sat in the chair by the window, cradling her in his arms and humming the same tunes he had once sung to Ethan. It wasn't a replacement, nor was it an attempt to erase the pain of what had been lost. It was simply an extension of the love he had always carried. As the years passed, our family grew not just in size but in depth, with moments that became the threads of a life richly lived. The dogwood tree flourished, its blossoms marking the passage of time, a reminder of the resilience of love and the beauty that could emerge even after the harshest of winters. Our daughter grew up beneath its branches, her laughter filling the air as she played in its shade, her presence a living testament to the hope and renewal that had guided us forward. Daniel and I often found ourselves reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. There were still moments when the past would surface, a photograph, a memory, a stray thought, but they no longer felt like weights dragging us down. Instead, they were reminders of how far we had come, of the love that had endured and grown despite everything. One evening, as we sat beneath the tree, watching our daughter chase fireflies in the fading light, Daniel turned to me with a smile. "Do you remember what you said to me that night in the kitchen?" After I found out the truth about Ethan? I tilted my head, trying to recall the moment. I said a lot of things, I teased gently. Which one are you thinking of? You told me that love is what makes a family, he said, his voice soft but steady. Not biology. Not perfection. Just love. You were right, Emily. You've always been right. I leaned into him, my heart full to the brim. And look at what we've built, I said, gesturing to our daughter, who was now twirling beneath the tree, her laughter ringing out like music. This is love, Daniel. This is our family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and amber, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything. The pain, the healing, the growth, and the love that had carried us through it all. The past had shaped us, but it didn't define us. What defined us was the life we had chosen to create. One rooted in forgiveness, resilience, and the unshakable belief that love, in all its messy, beautiful forms, was enough. The years continued their quiet march forward, bringing with them a blend of challenges and joys that made up the mosaic of our lives. Our daughter, Lily, grew into a vibrant and curious child, her laughter filling the house with a brightness that felt like sunlight pouring into every corner. She had Daniel's quiet thoughtfulness, paired with a fierce sense of determination that was entirely her own. Watching her discover the world was a daily reminder of the beauty in beginnings, of the resilience and wonder that life could hold. The dogwood tree became her favorite spot in the backyard, just as it had been for Daniel and me. She'd sit beneath its branches for hours, lost in her books or crafting elaborate stories with her dolls. Daniel had built her a small swing from one of its sturdier branches, and the sound of her delighted squeals as she soared through the air became one of the sweetest melodies of our days. It was impossible not to smile when I saw her there, her hair catching the light, her joy so pure and unrestrained. One spring afternoon, as the tree was beginning to bloom, Lily came to me with a question that stopped me in my tracks. She had been rummaging through some old boxes we'd yet to sort in the attic, her natural curiosity leading her to places I hadn't thought to guard from her exploration. She held a photograph in her small hands, one of the pictures of Rachel and Ethan that Daniel and I had decided to keep. Her brow furrowed in that endearing way she had when she was trying to puzzle something out. "Mommy," she asked, her voice filled with innocent curiosity. "Who are these people? They look like Daddy, but I don't know them." I knelt down beside her, taking the photo gently from her hands. My heart tightened as I stared at the image, memories and emotions swirling in a way that felt almost overwhelming. "That's your daddy," I said softly, pointing to Daniel's younger self. "And the little boy, that's Ethan. He was your daddy's first son." Her eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. "Daddy had another son?" she asked, her voice tinged with wonder. "Why didn't I know that?" I hesitated, trying to find the right words to explain something so complex to someone so young. "Ethan was part of Daddy's life before you were born," I said carefully. "And before I was in Daddy's life too. He and his mommy were very special to Daddy, but they aren't here with us anymore." Lily's expression grew somber, and she hugged the photo to her chest. "Did they go to heaven?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yes, sweetheart. They did. But they'll always be a part of Daddy's heart. And mine too." She was quiet for a moment, her young mind processing the weight of what I had told her. Then to my surprise she smiled. "I think it's nice that Daddy loved them so much," she said. "It means he has a big heart. Big enough to love me too." Tears welled in my eyes as I pulled her into a tight hug. "You're right, Lily," I whispered. "Your daddy has the biggest heart. And he loves you more than anything in the world." When Daniel came home that evening, Lily ran to him with the photograph, her excitement bubbling over as she shared what she had learned. "Daddy, I saw a picture of you and Ethan," she exclaimed. "Mommy told me all about him. I think it's really special that he was part of your life." Daniel froze for a moment, his eyes meeting mine over Lily's head. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression, but it quickly softened into something deeper. Gratitude, perhaps, or acceptance. He knelt down and pulled Lily into his arms, holding her close. "Ethan was very special to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like you are, Lily. I'm so glad you know about him now." The moment was simple, yet profound, a bridge between the past and the present that felt both healing and affirming. It marked a shift in our family, an openness that allowed for the fullness of our story to be embraced rather than hidden away. As Lily grew older, she continued to ask questions about Ethan and Rachel, her curiosity a natural extension of her loving and inquisitive nature. Daniel and I answered her as honestly as we could, sharing stories and memories that painted a picture of the people they had been. It wasn't always easy, but it felt right. The more we shared, the more I saw how those connections enriched her understanding of love and family. One summer, as the three of us stood together beneath the dogwood tree, its branches heavy with blossoms, Daniel suggested something that took me by surprise. "What if we planted another tree?" he said, his hand resting on Lily's shoulder. "One for Lily, so she has something that grows with her too." Lily's face lit up with excitement. "Can it be a magnolia?" she asked. "I love their flowers. They're so big and pretty." Daniel chuckled, ruffling her hair. "A magnolia it is," he said. "We'll plant it right next to the dogwood. That way, the two trees can grow side by side just like our family." The idea filled me with warmth, a symbolic gesture that felt perfectly in tune with the journey we had been on. Together, we chose a young magnolia tree and planted it beside the dogwood, its delicate branches stretching toward the sky. Over time, the two trees grew together, their roots intertwining beneath the soil, their blossoms creating a stunning canopy of pinks and whites each spring. The years continued to pass, bringing with them the inevitable changes of life, new adventures, challenges, and milestones that marked the passage of time. But through it all, the dogwood and magnolia trees stood as constants, their growth a reminder of the enduring power of love and the beauty that could come from both loss and renewal. As I watched Lily grow into a compassionate and confident young woman, I often thought about the journey that had brought us to this place. The secrets we had uncovered, the pain we had endured, and the healing we had found together were all part of a story that had shaped us in ways I never could have imagined. It wasn't a perfect story. There were moments of doubt, fear, and grief, but it was ours, and it was beautiful in its honesty and resilience. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees and the world was bathed in a soft, golden light, Daniel and I stood together beneath the dogwood and magnolia, our hands intertwined. "We've come a long way," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and wonder. "We have," I agreed, leaning into him, "and I wouldn't change a thing." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, leaving the world in a serene twilight, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for everything, the past, the present, and the future that stretched out before us. Life, in all its messiness and beauty, had brought us here, and for that I was endlessly thankful. The trees in the backyard became more than just a marker of time. They were living symbols of everything our family had endured and created together. Seasons came and went, each one leaving its subtle imprint on the branches, the blossoms, the leaves. The dogwood, older and stronger, seemed to stand as a guardian over the newer magnolia, its roots intertwined with a wisdom earned through years of surviving storms and basking in sunlight. The magnolia, youthful and vibrant, reached skyward with an almost unrestrained enthusiasm, its enormous blossoms opening wide as if to greet the world with an unabashed joy. Lily's childhood unfolded beneath those trees, a mix of scraped knees, endless laughter, and the imaginative stories she spun in their shade. I often watched her from the kitchen window, marveling at how effortlessly she found happiness in the simplest things. Whether she was reading a book while sprawled on the grass, trying to climb the dogwood's lower branches, or collecting fallen petals to press into her journal, her presence radiated life. She was everything Daniel and I had hoped for and more. A constant reminder that the future was not something to fear but to embrace. One late autumn evening, Daniel and I sat together on the bench beneath the dogwood, bundled in sweaters against the crisp air. The magnolia had lost its last leaves, leaving its branches bare and stark against the fading light. Lily was inside, her laughter occasionally spilling through the open kitchen window as she recounted her day to the family dog, who seemed to listen attentively. Daniel leaned back, gazing at the sky as it darkened to a deep indigo. "It's strange," he said after a long pause, his breath visible in the cool air. "I used to think that happiness was something fragile, something you had to hold on to with both hands or it would slip away. But now, it feels more like this." He gestured to the trees, their silhouettes etched against the horizon. "It's something rooted. Even when the seasons change, Even when everything looks different, it's still there. I reached for his hand, intertwining my fingers with his. Because we built it, I said softly. We planted it, nurtured it, and gave it space to grow. It's not something that can be taken away. It's part of us now. He turned to me, his expression tender. I couldn't have done it without you, Emily. You've been my strength, my anchor. You've taught me how to live again. I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. And you've taught me what it means to love without fear. We've done this together, Daniel. Every step of the way. The wind rustled the branches above us, scattering a few lingering leaves onto the ground. The moment felt almost sacred, a quiet acknowledgement of how far we had come and the unshakable bond we had formed. As the stars began to appear, their light breaking through the darkness, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. Lily grew older, and with her came the inevitable changes that every parent faces. Her world expanded beyond the confines of our backyard, her curiosity leading her into friendships, hobbies, and adventures that filled her days. She joined a local soccer team, spent hours sketching in her notebooks, and developed a love for baking that transformed our kitchen into a whirlwind of flour and laughter. Watching her grow was both exhilarating and bittersweet. Each new milestone brought pride, but also a quiet reminder that time was moving faster than I had anticipated. One summer, as Lily prepared for her first overnight camp, she found herself drawn back to the attic, a place she had largely ignored after that first discovery of the photo of Rachel and Ethan. I heard her rummaging around one afternoon, the telltale creaks of the floorboards signaling her exploration. When she came down, her arms were full of old items she had unearthed, books, trinkets, and a small tin box that had once belonged to Rachel. "Mom," she said, setting the box on the kitchen table. "Can we open this together? I want to know more about Rachel and Ethan." Her request caught me off guard, but it also warmed my heart. Over the years, we had shared bits and pieces of their story with her, but the idea of exploring these relics together felt like an opportunity to deepen her understanding of where she came from. Daniel joined us, his expression a mixture of curiosity and calm, as we opened the box and sifted through its contents. Inside, we found a collection of small but meaningful treasures. A locket with a picture of Ethan as a baby, a pressed flower that must have held some significance to Rachel, and a handwritten note folded neatly into quarters. The note was addressed to Daniel, its edges worn but the ink still clear. He hesitated before opening it, his eyes scanning the words as Lily and I waited silently. When he finished, he looked up at us, his expression soft but resolute. "It's just her telling me what I already know now," he said. "That she loved me, that she loved Ethan, and that she hoped I'd find happiness, no matter what happened." Lily reached out, placing her hand over his. "She would be proud of you, Daddy," she said. "Of everything you've done. Of the family you've built." Daniel's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and he pulled her into a tight hug. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you'll ever know." The years continued to unfold, each one bringing new memories, new challenges, and new reasons to celebrate. Lily eventually left for college, her absence leaving a quiet stillness in the house that took some getting used to. Daniel and I leaned on each other during that transition, finding solace in the routines we had built and the deep connection we shared. The dogwood and magnolia trees stood tall in the backyard, their intertwined branches a testament to the life we had created. A life rooted in love, resilience, and the unwavering belief that together, we could weather anything. One evening as we sat beneath those trees, the sky painted with the colors of another beautiful sunset, Daniel took my hand and said something that stayed with me forever. "This is what love looks like," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not perfect, not always easy, but enduring, growing, stronger with every storm." I leaned into him, my heart full. "And it's ours," I said. "Every part of it." And in that moment, surrounded by the life we had built, I knew that no matter what the future held, we had created something truly lasting. Something that would continue to bloom, season after season, long after we were gone. As the years went on, life settled into a comforting rhythm. Lily thrived in college, calling often to share her experiences and dreams. Daniel and I grew closer than ever, finding joy in the quieter pace of our days. The shared moments that no longer felt fleeting but deeply rooted in all we had built together. The dogwood and magnolia trees in the backyard became a sanctuary not only for us but for the memories of the lives that had shaped ours. They stood tall, their intertwined branches a silent witness to the journey we had taken. A journey marked by loss, love, and the strength to move forward. One day, years after Lily had grown into a confident young woman with a life of her own, Daniel and I found ourselves sitting together beneath the trees, watching the late afternoon sun filter through the leaves. The air was warm, and the faint scent of blossoms lingered, a familiar reminder of the seasons we had shared in this space. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked, his voice soft, reflective. I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. "All the time," I said. "It's amazing, isn't it? How something so painful can lead to something so beautiful." He nodded, his fingers lacing through mine. "I think about them, Rachel and Ethan, every now and then, but it's not the same kind of pain anymore. Gratitude, I guess. Gratitude for what they taught me, for the love they gave me, and for how they brought me to you." I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming fullness of a life that had been lived with purpose and love. "I think they'd be proud of you," I said softly. "Of us. And I'm proud of us," he said, his voice steady, warm. "We made something beautiful out of everything we've been through. Something lasting." As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and amber, I thought about all that had brought us here, the secrets that had come to light, the heartbreaks we had faced, and the healing that had grown in their place. Life hadn't been perfect, but it had been real, and that was more than enough. In the years that followed, our home remained a place of love, laughter, and memory. Lily visited often, bringing with her the excitement of new stories, new dreams. The trees in the backyard grew taller, their branches offering shade to a new generation as grandchildren's laughter echoed through the same spaces where Lily had once played. And through it all, Daniel and I remained side by side, our love steady and enduring, the roots of our story stretching deep and strong. One evening, as twilight painted the sky with the soft glow of another day's end, Daniel and I sat together beneath the trees once more. The air was still, the kind of quiet that felt sacred. He turned to me, his expression peaceful, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," he said, his voice calm but certain. "But I know that this, our life, our family, has been everything I could have ever hoped for. Thank you, Emily, for all of it." I smiled, tears slipping down my cheeks as I reached for his hand. "And thank you, Daniel, for choosing love, for choosing us." As the first stars appeared in the night sky, I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his presence, the steady beat of his heart. In that moment, I knew that we had created something truly timeless. Not just a life, but a legacy. A testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and the unyielding strength to grow together, no matter what. And as the years unfolded, as the seasons continued their eternal cycle, the trees stood as a reminder of everything we had endured and everything we had built. Their branches reached toward the heavens, their roots anchored deeply in the earth, just as we had been, rooted in love, reaching for hope and standing strong, no matter what storms came our way.